Everyone. We're going to continue our talk about cells and look at how single cells evolved into multicellular organisms. And this is true of all life. And but what we're going to do is really explore this more in depth through Kingdom Animalia. So we started out with our protists, and so now we're going to look at what are the similarities of cells with our protists, look at an ancestor, and then look at how multicellular life may have evolved from that common ancestor, single-celled, and then look at that through the lens of animals. Much of what we'll say also takes place with plants, but since we already discussed plants in the ecology section, I'll just give a few reminders here along the way. Okay, so one thing to remember is that, again, remember that cells, all of our eukaryotic cells are very similar to one another. So they need to be able to exchange materials. It means get the materials that they need to do the cellular functions, and that comes from the external environment. And then when they're doing work they need to do, they need to get rid of the waste out of their cells and put that back into the external environment, right? So that includes obtaining the energy, like I said here. Once they do have nutrients and the building blocks that they need, then they need to be able within their cell to synthesize complex molecules. So for example, if they get some amino acids, they can use those amino acids to put together and create proteins, right? If they get glucose, they might put those chains of glucose together to make something more complex like starch or glycogen or something like that. Starch would be made in plants, there I go, right? And then cells need to be able to reproduce themselves. So they need to be able to duplicate their DNA and reproduce into a new cell. Okay. And then they also need to detect and respond to signals that are within their immediate environment. And that way they can also, those signals might be from other cells in their immediate environment. So I put these two animals here. This one is a planaria, very, very teeny tiny little organism. And of course you recognize the elephant. And I put those two there because these are multicellular organisms, both from the animal kingdom. And they're very, very different in size, but their cell size is about the same. So remember, that has to do with the surface area to volume ratio that we talked about in a previous lecture. Okay. All right, so here's our ancestry. So this is showing you all the protists that are broken up into different supergroups, and we'll talk about supergroups later in the semester. But mainly what I want you to see here is here, way over on the end is Kingdom Animalia. And so recall that we believe that the common protist ancestor is a choanocyte or a choanoflagellate. So I'm going to show you a picture of a cell now, but this type of a tree just shows relationship, that there are enough structures or enough parts of their molecular structures that are similar to one another, that they were probably inherited from a common ancestor. And that's what the little stalk here is. If you look way over down here, here's Kingdom Plantae as a reminder. And remember that we looked at, they're from a group called Archaeoplastida, where you can see there are several protists in that group, the green algae, things like that. And we believe that they had a charophyte common ancestor. Okay, so again, all life we believe started are related to each other through single-celled organisms. So if we can really understand the structure of single cells and how they function, that'll give us an idea of how multicellularity evolved. Okay, so here are the choanoflagellates, the protists. You can see them as single-celled organisms here. This is what they look like. They've got a single flagellum surrounded by a little collar, right? And these are like little tentacles. It's the cytoplasm that pushes through the cell membrane or pushes out the cell membrane, forming little tentacles. One of the important things though about this single-celled organism compared to other ones is that they do live colonially. So they can secrete the stalk, and then each one can attach itself to it. So now they can live as a group, share nutrients, they can divide up the reproductive abilities. So they're normally related to one another, they're normally identical with DNA. So it would make sense then that if a different one cell was taking on the duties of reproduction, because it's producing the same DNA. Okay, so in and of itself, it's like, yeah, big deal. How is that related to animals? Well, when we look at the choanoflagellate cell itself, there's a lot of similarities to types of cells that are found within certain groups of Animalia, right? And so here's what we can see. This is the choanoflagellate cell, a single cell. There's the flagellum with the tentacle, collar of tentacles, right? Here they are living colonially. And so remember that by living colonially, the cells can cooperate and live as a group and divide up the duties, but they can also separate and live as a perfectly well as a single cell. They can take on all the required duties for themselves again. But here's a cell called a choanocyte, and this is associated with an animal. So this one we're seeing, and we'll look at this a little bit later again, but these cells are lined on the inside of sponges. Okay, so sponges are one of the oldest phylum of Animalia that we know of, a very broad group. It's called a phylum within a kingdom. And so this is one of the oldest groups. But we also find choanocytes in cnidarians, which are like your jellyfish and anemones, things like that. In the flatworms, you saw that picture of a flatworm with the elephant that was there. And they're also found in echinoderms. Those are your things like your sea stars, sea urchins, those type of organisms. Okay. So, one thing I wanted to mention too. So they're they're similar in structure. You can see how similar they look like, the cell type, but they're also similar molecularly. And so when we do look at their DNA, both in the mitochondrion and in the nucleus, there's a lot of molecular similarities that are going on. So basically that's called independent conformation. We're looking at evidence from two different lines that are not related to one another. Okay, so the structure of the cell, studying the structure of the cell, the anatomical structures, it's not related to the studies of the molecular molecules that we're studying within these cells. So that's lines of evidence from two independent sources. So we call that independent conformation. Okay, the lines of evidence both point toward the same or similar conclusion. Sorry if you hear a dog barking, that's my dog Samson out there. Okay, so just to kind of jump us in, because we're going to be talking about animals, I do want you to be aware, excuse me, of some of the characteristics that all animals share. What makes an organism an animal? So they're multicellular. Again, no animals live as cells that are colonial. They are considered multicellular. So that means the cells need one another to survive. One can't break off and live as its own entity, as a single-celled organism. So that's the difference between colonialism. Multicellularity, there's going to be a diversity of different cell types, but they all need each other to be able to live as an organism. Okay, all animals are heterotrophic. They cannot make their own energy, right? They lack cell walls in their cells. So that's something very different that we saw in Plantae and also with fungi, right? So animals move, so we can't afford, having a cell wall would restrict our movements. Animals reproduce sexually. Okay, so we will be studying reproduction a little bit later in the semester as well. So it's always sexual reproduction, never asexual reproduction. They have particular body plans that are determined by a set of genes called Hox genes. So early in the development of an embryo, the Hox genes turn on, and it provides the instructions of what the body plan is going to look like. So when we look at different groups of Animalia, we're actually going to be looking at their specific body plan in their group. Okay. And then also they have an embryonic development. And so being multicellular, they're going to start as a single-celled organism, a zygote. So there's going to be a sperm that fertilizes the egg, and the nuclei are going to fuse together, and it's going to become a single cell, diploid cell. And that'll be the zygote. And then it's during the embryonic development that the cells are going to start to divide and start to produce the tissues that are associated with that animal. Okay? And once those tissues develop, we'll see that most animals have these types of tissues. They have nerves, they have muscles. Those two things give them the capacity to move at some point in their life cycle. Okay, so they're going to have the ability to move under their own power. Muscles are the types of tissues that provide the actual movement, the force to pull on something. The nerves stimulate those muscles to be able to do that. Okay. And also then, remember again, we can look at molecularly, and we find all organisms that we have classified as animals share a similar sequence for their ribosomal RNA. Okay, so we've looked at single cells, and what we need to understand is that to get to multicellularity is what happens now is that the organism forms tissues. Tissues are a collection of cells, or they're stable associations of cells that then take on a similar structure and function within the tissue. The cells themselves have similar structure and function, so that they produce a tissue that can function as a whole. All those single cells can function separately, and they do chemical reactions within their cells separately, but they all do them usually in a coordinated fashion, which then allows the tissues, the structure to function as a whole. We saw this already with our plants. Remember that we saw that there were basically three cell types, three main cell types, the parenchyma cells, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma cells. And then we saw that those three cell types can group together and they can form tissues. And in the plants, we saw tissues such as ground tissue, dermal tissue, vascular tissue. Okay. And then we saw that those tissues can layer in a particular way to form organs. And in the plants, we saw the organs were things like the leaves, the stems, that kind of stuff, the roots. Okay, so in Animalia, we're also going to see individual cell types, and the main cell types, there's many of them, but the main cell types we're going to see are epithelial cells, something called fibroblasts, nerve cells, muscle cells. Well, when those similar cells with similar structure and function get together, epithelial cells then form epithelial tissue. Fibroblasts can form different types of connective tissue. Nerve cells form the nerve tissue, and muscle cells form muscle tissue. So now we're starting to see kind of a hierarchy of organization. From a simple structure of the cell, now we're going to start to form tissues. From there, the tissues, we said, I gave the example with the plants. Now those can layer in a particular order and form organs. So cells need to be able to communicate. And this is one of the hallmarks, we think, what happened to evolve from single-celled organisms to colonial organisms to multicellular organisms. So even single-celled organisms needed a way to communicate with one another. Okay? They do this in order to coordinate with one another, especially when they start to live colonially. There had to be some communication going on for one cell to take on the reproductive duties while other cells were continuously taking in nutrients and then synthesizing those nutrients into the molecules that were needed inside of the cell, and they would share them. Okay? In multicellular organisms, then that cell communication within those tissues is important to coordinate the cellular actions. Okay? And that can go from a very small level to a very broad level, right? So those cells then, once they're communicating, not only coordinating the cellular actions, but it ends up allowing organs to coordinate with one another, and then even organ systems to coordinate with one another. So an example I have here is, say, for example, you smell food, and before you even put the food in your mouth, your stomach begins to secrete acids. So there was a cellular communication coming down from your brain once it detected the smell of the food to tell your stomach to start secreting an acid because of the expectation of putting that food in your mouth and starting digestion. Okay, so that's a type of signaling that's going on within your body. And there's different types of signaling within the body. So one that we're going to see throughout this unit is called paracrine signaling. And these are just when one cell wants to communicate with nearby cells in the very close vicinity. So it will release a molecule, and that molecule doesn't have to travel far. It just travels to an adjacent cell or one very close in its area. If it needs to secrete a signaling molecule further away, like your brain signaling your stomach, it might release a hormone. And so by definition, a hormone are chemical messengers that get secreted into a bloodstream. So mostly we're going to see hormones when we start to get more complex animals that develop a cardiovascular system. Okay. There's also a type of chemical signal called a neurotransmitter. And these are usually released, or they're always released by nerves. So this has to be with animals that have a nerve tissue. And so that nerve then can release this chemical neurotransmitter to another nerve cell to signal that nerve cell to produce electricity, or to signal a muscle cell, and it'll cause that muscle cell to contract, or to signal a gland to secrete something like a sweat gland or something like that. So we want to keep in mind the cell signaling. We know that protists do it, and they also release chemicals, or single-celled organisms, I should say, not just the protists, but they release chemicals in order to communicate with one another. And we retain that ability. We think that was also part of the ability to set the stage for multicellularity. Because again, in multicellular animals, those cells need to coordinate with one another. And you do that through cell signaling. So here's, we mentioned that animals form embryonic tissues. We do know that plants also form embryonic tissues, right? But here, again, I'm going to use a line of animals so that we can see how tissues develop. Okay, so one of the things to remember is that I had already mentioned that all animals start as a single cell called a zygote. So that's after sexual reproduction occurs, after the sperm fertilizes the egg. They merge their nuclei and they become a single cell called a zygote. Okay, you're familiar with this term. We've seen it already. Okay, so this is a diploid cell. But then during the embryonic developing, this cell will divide by mitosis and duplicate itself. And so it'll continue to do that until it forms a ball, a hollow sphere called a blastula. Okay, so this is hollow, but you can see all the individual cells around it that make up that sphere. So that's called a blastula. Then, on one end of the blastula, the cells will invaginate and they start to form another layer inside of the blastula. Okay, right here, here's that other layer. At this stage, then we call this structure now a gastrula. This invagination is called gastrulation, sorry. And so the structure is called the gastrula. And it's at this point now that we see three tissues that are formed. So these are individual cells. The cells are beginning to differentiate, take on a different function from one another. That's what differentiate means. And it does that because, remember, all cells have the same a copy of all the DNA, because it started as a single cell and it began duplicating DNA to create new cells, or yeah, new cells, right? So, but within that DNA of certain cells now, they're specializing. So that means some of the genes are turning on while other ones are not. And so again, we see 3 tissue layers. The outer tissue layer is called the ectoderm. The inner tissue layer is called the endoderm. And then in some animals, most animals, you'll get a 3rd layer in there. And this one's called the mesoderm, the red that's pointed out here. Okay. So here's the little blow up of that. So the ectoderm, the outer layer, then from the embryonic stage, these cells will continue to divide and they'll differentiate even more. So the ectoderm layer will then begin to form structures like an outer covering protective layer like the skin, and it can also differentiate into a nervous system. Okay, the inner layer, the endoderm, what you see in yellow there, that becomes mainly lines the digestive organs and becomes the digestive organs themselves. Okay? And then those animals that have the middle layer or the mesoderm, this is what becomes skeletal structures, the muscles, and the cardiovascular system. Okay? So you want to remember these 3 layers, have an idea of what they later differentiate into, because we're going to see each of these organ systems. Okay, and then you'll be able to know by identifying the organ systems if this is an animal that had 2 embryonic layers, some only have ectoderm and endoderm, or if they have the 3 embryonic layers. And that's what we saw up here. There are some animals that are classified as radial. We'll talk about that later. They have the 2 embryonic layers. That's called dipoblastic. Okay. Most other animals like us, we have 3 embryonic layers. That's called tripoblastic. Okay, and so just be aware that sometimes when we talk about embryonic tissue layers, they might just be called the embryonic cell layers. Sometimes embryonic tissues are referred to as germ layers. A germ cell or germ layers are undifferentiated cells or tissues, and they can become other tissues. And that's what we saw here. They can become these other tissues. Okay, so from these tissues, we're going to get 4 main tissue types that develop, but each of those can have their own subtype, right? So muscle, for example, muscle is one main type of tissue that develops in Animalia, but there can be skeletal muscle, which is what attaches to our bones. Or if you're an animal that doesn't have bones, but you have an exoskeleton, an outer covering, it attaches within the exoskeleton and causes movement. Okay? So we're going to look at the skeletal muscle system more closely in a later lecture. Another type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle. And so smooth muscle is usually associated with hollow organs or other cavities in the body. Okay? And usually helps to move fluids through those organs. The cardiac muscle is the 3rd type of muscle tissue, and that's only found in the heart. Next, next we have nerve tissue. So nerve is the 2nd type of main tissue in Animalia. Nerve tissue is made out of nerve cells that look like this. Again, when we study the nervous system, we're going to look more closely at that cell. But their job, they have the ability to create electrical signals and conduct them down their cell membranes, and then release a neurotransmitter at the end. Remember that chemical signaling molecule to stimulate another tissue. So we mentioned earlier that nerve tissue can stimulate, for example, muscle tissue. It can stimulate your heart to contract faster. It can stimulate your skeletal muscles to move. When I'm doing this, I've got nerves stimulating the muscles in my arms to do this. Okay? So they can be, you notice when you see these cell shapes that they can take on very different shapes. Okay, so if you learned about cell types in high school or in general biology, realize everything you learned about a cell, it's the same thing here. These are all eukaryotic cells too. And they've just differentiated, so they take on a different shape because they take on a different function. Structure determines function. Okay. Next one is epithelial tissue. There's a third type of tissue, epithelial tissue. But you can see the diversity of tissues that there are within epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue are usually just sheets of densely packed cells. Again, they tend to cover the body. Your skin is epithelial tissue. It can also cover, surround individual organs or line individual organs. It lines the wall of our cavities. It's mainly specialized to protect, like it is on the outer activity. You've got epithelial down your esophagus. So if you eat something hot or rough, the epithelial layer protects any scratching or heat that can harm. It's specialized to secrete substances. So the cell might create certain chemicals like sweat and secrete it out of the body. And it's also specialized for absorbing. So for example, in your intestines, when you, after digestion, you've broken down food molecules into the small molecules that are needed inside of our cells, it gets absorbed across the epithelial layer to get into our bloodstream. Okay, so just like we saw with protists that need to take in tiny food molecules out of the environment and bring them into their cell so that they can do work, we need to do the same. We need to bring food from the external environment. We will have the ability to break the food down within our body, digestion, and then absorb it. We saw fungi digest the food outside of their body and then they absorb it. So it's all the same principle with our cells. Okay, here's the fourth tissue, connective tissues. Okay, connective tissues are also a wide variety. So I'll show you, so that's what is on this slide. There's so many of them. I couldn't squish everything onto one slide. So their jobs, so again, they can have variable jobs because they're so widely distributed and there's such a diversity of them. So they might connect structures together, like tendons are connective tissue. So they connect your muscles to your bones. Ligaments connect bone to bone, right? They might anchor something down. They might provide support, a scaffolding for support. So here's a list of, not a complete list of connective tissues, but connective tissues are, your blood is considered a connective tissue. Fat, also known as adipose tissue. Your bones are connective tissue. Cartilage. There's also what's called loose and dense connective tissues. These are things like I mentioned, the tendons and ligaments. You have connective tissue under the epithelial layer of your skin, right? That's in the dermal layer, that's connective tissue. Okay, so you can see that they do a lot of jobs here. But again, they don't do all of those jobs all at once. It's just because of the variability in their structures that they can take on a lot of different functions. So again, you don't have to memorize all this stuff right now, because as we study organisms, we're going to see much of this and we'll learn about it then. Okay. So out of those 4 tissue types, including their subtypes, we can take those, and there are at least 2 types of tissues, or all 4 or more, 2 or more, so it can go up to all 4. Once those combine, you can form an organ, right? And so it depends on how the tissues are layered to produce the function that they do, that gives us the organ. So here you can see in the stomach, we've got an inner layer of epithelial tissue. We've got connective tissue around it on either side. There are 3 layers of muscle tissue. This happens to be smooth muscle here. And then there's nerve tissue in the middle. Okay, so now we've gone from single cell organism, we've gone to single cells within our embryos, and then our embryos begin to divide and they produce tissues. Those tissues can differentiate into one of these 4 tissues, include their subtype. Now we can take those tissues and organize them in a particular way to make an organ. And so when those tissue types cooperate, it produces the function of that organ. Okay, so again, within these tissues, there's going to be communication so that those tissues coordinate in such a way for the stomach to function. So we're going to see some of these epithelial cells secreting substances into the lumen, or the space inside of the organs, called the lumen, L-U-M-E-N. And while it's doing that, the nerves are going to signal the muscle tissue to contract. And so that's going to help mix up the food within the fluids and mix it up with the enzymes and start the process of breaking it down. And connective tissue holds everything together, because the stomach is churning around like this. It needs to make sure that the tissues don't separate. So connective tissue does just that. It connects it together. Okay, so that then our organs can work together and form organ systems, right? And so in our organ systems, we have our integumentary system, which is that outer layer, our skin. That's an organ. Underneath that, we have our bones, our skeletal system, and we move our bones with our muscular system, right? Our muscular system gets signaled by our nervous system. We have another system called the endocrine system, which can create those hormones I mentioned earlier to also help coordinate all of these organs, right? Many of these, all of our signaling molecules and nutrients and waste travels through our cardiovascular system. So we can go on. We're going to hit these organ systems in this semester, right? So this is all controlled. So genes set the stage for how these taking chemicals and molecules to create the structures that help to create the cells, and the cells then cooperate to create our tissues, and our tissues then make our organs, and then our several organs cooperate to make the organ system. And then there's coordination between organ systems as well. Okay, so again, this is that hierarchical level of organization, and we see this in Animalia, also Plantae. We start with single cells, become tissues, which become organs, which become organ systems to make the organism that you are. Okay. Let me pause the video here, and I may stop the video and continue the next portion in part